is Mini-Spec. Pure Spec is happening November 16th to the 18th in the Graham McEwen Robbins Health Center. You should absolutely go there and have lots of fun.
Have a reasonable amount of fun, not too much. You gotta pace yourself.
Absolutely. It's a whole weekend.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm James Lees.
My name is Brendan Schatz.
We are from Comics A Blog, which is hopefully your best source of positive comics and pop culture news.
Right.
And we're here to MC and introduce everything. So our first speaker actually is Allan Mott. Allan was once accused of being a narcissistic goth lesbian by a disgruntled Amazon reviewer, which is pretty amazing. He is also heir to the applesauce fortune. That pretty much sums up his writing career, which includes 12 and a half books and contributions to sites as XO Jane, Connexploitation, Bookasm, and Flick Attack. His most personal writing can be found at vanityfair.com, where he uses the subject of B-movies to mostly talk about boobs and stuff. And he's going to be talking about the ghost story of Docs. So, everybody welcome Allan.
I wrote 12 and a half books, and most of them were actually written the week before the deadline. And that's exactly what happened with this. I wrote it about 5 hours ago, so I apologize. But this is what I got. I think if you ask most writers to identify the best part of getting paid to write for the first time, they'll tell you it's the fact that from that point on, whenever you're at a party or any social gathering and someone asks you what you do, you can look them straight in the eye and honestly say those 4 magic words. I am a writer. Now, chances are you've already been saying something close to this for years. Something like, I'm trying to be a writer, or I'm working on becoming a writer. Because even that sounds better than I work in a warehouse, or I'm a barista at Starbucks. But now that someone out there in the mythical land of publishing has read your work and deemed it worthy for not only publication, but also financial remuneration, you no longer have to state it as an ambition, but rather as a cold, hard fact. I am a writer. I write, and people pay me to do it. But of course, this does not come without a price. There is a toll to be paid for the privilege, one that you have to pay many, many times. And it is this. People are always going to ask you the question. Now, there are a lot of little questions that you'll often hear, but the question is the one that matters. The only one people actually care about, because they too want to do what you have done and stop having to say, I'm trying, and actually say, I am. How does a person become a professional writer? At this point in my career, I am prepared for this question, having answered it more times than I can count. Every time it is presented to me with wide eyes and a look of distant yearning, I pause and allow the gravitas of the moment to build in anticipation of the wisdom I am about to share. I stand straighter and take on a serious look on my face, and I say, the first thing you have to do in order to become a professional writer is get a job at a Greek restaurant. Now, more often than not, the person who asks this for this sage advice, looks to me as if I have lost my mind. Sometimes they assume I'm joking and smile and laugh. Sometimes they back away slowly and run to tell their friends about the crazy person in their midst. But the thing is, I am completely serious. In my personal experience, this is the quickest way for any ambitious young wannabe to make the leap to professional writing. In September of 1998, I was 22 and got a job washing dishes at Yanni's Taverna on White Avenue. It was my first restaurant job after a full year of working in a warehouse, and it was a completely new experience. Well, I'm sure everyone at the warehouse was very friendly and nice. I had nothing in common with them and found it very difficult to communicate. Yanni's, on the other hand, was filled to bursting with pretentious jerks, just like me! That's how I met Dan Asfar, a handsome 24-year-old of Italian and Lebanese descent, who waited tables while getting his degree in history from the U of A. From a distance, Dan and I were very different people. He was charismatic and well-liked by everyone he met, while I was not. Yet, once he found out that I harbored the same literary ambitions he did and possessed a shocking proficiency for movie trivia, he sought out my company, and we became good acquaintances, if not friends. His best friend was a fellow waiter named Edric Thay, who was frequently asked by customers, "What part of Greece are you from?" Which he always answered by saying, "The eastern part, the far eastern part, China." Edric was also a wannabe writer who worked at Yanny's in the summers before going out to the States to get his master's degree in journalism. Now, Dan was such a popular waiter that often people would specifically ask to be placed in his section. One of these folks was a large, somewhat silly man in a crisp white shirt and black pants, who, with his thick black mustache and strange, high-pitched giggle, resembled Oliver Hardy, the legendary comedian who constantly got into music trouble with his partner Stan Laurel. His name was Shane Kennedy, and he considered himself a man of the people, even though he was the successful owner of a local publishing company that specialized in books about nature and gardening called Lone Pine. Whenever Shane sat in Dan's section, which was often several times a week, he would ask him questions about his life, and that's how we found out about Dan's passion for history and desire to become a writer. It turned out that Shane's company had started a new imprint called Folklore that was going to publish books about the Wild West and Canadian history. And after a night of much ouzo, Shane suggested to Dan that he might be the perfect person to write one of these books. As a result of this, Dan got the opportunity to write some additional chapters and do some rewriting on a manuscript that another writer had turned in, but wasn't considered publishable. Everyone at Lone Pine was so impressed by the results, he was assigned a book of his own. And once he completed that, he was offered a full-time position as a staff writer at the company. But rather than continue working on the books about the Canadian frontier, Dan was assigned projects about the company's latest imprint, Ghost House Books, which was created to exploit the popularity of a series of books written by a local author named Barbara Smith. In fact, Lone Pine was so gung-ho about his new project that they asked Dan if he knew any writers who might be interested in also working at the company. He immediately suggested Edric, who was hired pretty much immediately. A year later, around the spring of 2002, they asked him again, and remember the short dishwasher he occasionally talked movies with back at Yanny's. At that moment, I was working the graveyard shift at Source Adult Video, so I didn't hesitate to say yes when he called and asked if I was interested. So, for those keeping track, that's 1, 2, 3 writers who could trace the beginning of their professional careers to having worked at a Greek restaurant. I don't sound so crazy now, do I? But before I was hired, I had to produce some evidence that I could actually do the job, which, seemed fair. I was actually applying to work on a book in the folklore division, but for my writing sample, I decided to craft something more suitable for Ghost House. My original inclination was to write a ghost story about a fireman trapped in the rubble at Ground Zero after 9/11, which at the time was only a year away, and it was still very much a raw wound in everyone's mind. I abandoned this because it seemed a bit too timely, and I instead looked back to another troubled period in American history. I liked the idea of having a fireman as my protagonist, so I told this tale of Josiah, a black firefighter in Alabama who was forced to retire from his job when he's diagnosed with a degenerative eye disease that eventually renders him completely blind. Having little else to do, he passes his time at a local recreation center, which requires him to take a short trip on the bus each day. One afternoon, he's sitting at the stop close to his home when he smells the scent of perfume in the air and decides to start a conversation with the person it's coming from. Her name is Lucille, and it turns out she's a very polite young woman who's happy to talk with him. As the months pass, the two becomes friends as they talk to each other at the bus each day, until finally she asks him to tell her the story of why he became a fireman. He grows quiet because it's not a story he's told before, but he decides she deserves to hear it. He tells her how, when he was a young boy, his mother sent him out to the local store to buy some flour so she could make biscuits for dinner that night, and instead of going back home right away, he loitered in the store to read some comic books. And while he was there, the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen walked through the door, and he listened as she told the store owner about a meeting at the nearby church that was being held that night to discuss the possibility of organizing a bus boycott like the one occurring a few towns over in Montgomery. Intrigued, he followed the woman out of the store and down the street as she walked to the church. It was only when she went inside that he realized his mother was going to kill him if he didn't get back with the flour she wanted. He turned around and started running towards home when he heard a terrible sound suddenly erupt behind him. He could feel the heat from where he stood, and he turned around and saw that the church was gone, replaced by a wall of flame. That, he tells Lucille, is why he became a firefighter. She tells him how much she admires the boycott movement, which he takes as a sign of historical respect. until she tells him that when she gets on the bus she's waiting for, she's going to sit in the front, and they'll have to take her to jail before she'll move to the back. Josiah is confused because the buses haven't been segregated for decades. It is only then he asks her if she would mind if he touched her face to get a sense of what she looked like. She agrees, and with her face in his hands, Josiah realizes he's sitting with the most beautiful woman he's ever seen, and that she's waiting for a bus that will never come. And he decides he's going to wait there, right along with her. So yeah, I got the job. But after they liked my story, they decided I should work on the ghost books instead of the history stuff, which suited me just fine because there are a few things I find more tedious and boring than Canadian history. My first assignment was a sequel to a book Dan and Edric had worked on called Ghost Stories of America. It required that I tell 50 true ghost stories from each of the American states, not counting the territories of Guam and Puerto Rico. My elation over suddenly becoming a professional writer almost overnight was powerful, but not so powerful to overcome the sudden dread that came from being responsible for producing an entire 60,000-word manuscript in 4 months, which is something I had never attempted before. But that was my biggest problem. My biggest problem was that I was, to put it politely, somewhat skeptical about my subject matter. As someone who describes himself as an existential agnostic, I didn't believe in the supernatural and had concluded years earlier that ghost stories, as a rule, were total BS. So I started working on that first book. I decided to try and keep an open mind. This lasted 3 days. The problem was that in my research, which consisted of me reading other books, I kept seeing totally explainable incidents described as completely unexplainable. So I would read 3 different versions of the same supposedly true event and find that the details of each version differed significantly, including dates, locations, and names. If those details could be constantly verified, how much faith could be had in the ones that defied basic logic? I wasn't the only one who noticed this. Both Dan and Edric had the same problem. In their early works, they tried to overcome it by focusing on the historical aspect of the stories they were working on. But both of them were told to stop doing this because the results were, to use the managing editor's words, really boring. This was how the 3 of us discovered what I dubbed the ghostwriter's paradox. People want the stories they read in these books to be true. But if you actually tell them the truth, you end up with ghost stories books without any ghosts in them. Stick to the facts, and the result is almost inevitably boring. Get too creative, and they call BS on you, and get just as upset. We all developed methods to overcome this inherent problem with the genre. Dan and Edric took a very journalistic approach and interviewed as many people as they could, hoping their narratives would disguise their own skepticism. I couldn't follow this direction because I felt this too often meant nursing other people's delusions. One of the first books I read when I got the job was one Dan had written on a bunch of people who call themselves ghost hunters. I told him I couldn't finish it because reading his interviews with them struck me as being the equivalent of going to the local comic book and science fiction expo and interviewing everyone dressed in a Star Trek uniform as if they really were members of an interplanetary space federation. One woman in particular in the book struck me as more mentally ill than gifted with the ability to detect ghostly presences. Since he wrote that book, there have been several reality TV shows dedicated to the art of ghost hunting, which I find fascinating because in practice, they're like what would happen if someone made a cooking show, which was all about finding ingredients, but never actually resulted in the creation of a cooked dish. In every episode I've seen of these shows, you have people walking around dark, spooky places, getting scared while trying to find evidence of spectral activity without a ghost ever actually appearing on camera. To me, it's especially hilarious since it's these guys who end up deciding what's actually considered evidence in these cases. It's like we decided to go on a fairy hunt, using our iPhones as fairy finders. Since we all know the presence of fairies causes reception disturbance, I mean, that's just a fact. We can use the amount of boards we have on each corner to discern where the fairies might have once been. Though we might have actually find any fairies, we will be able to present the proof that they do exist. Anyway, instead of talking to people for my first 2 books, America 2 and Haunted Schools, I just tried to walk the tightrope. Try my best to tell entertaining stories that didn't go too far into the realm of the unbelievable. I thought I succeeded until one day a wife of one of our graphic designers told me I was her favorite ghost story author because she loved my sarcastic tone. I thought I'd been doing a really good job at hiding my snarky disbelief, but it turned out it was right there on the page for everyone to see. It didn't help that I went out of my way to sneak stuff in past the editors just to be a jerk. Like the one story in Haunted Schools about a boy who's so obsessed with mastering his trumpet that he dies as a result, which I wrote as a metaphor for masturbation. I call that one A Boy and His Instrument. Actually, for Haunted Schools, I did make at least one attempt at replicating Dan and Edric's approach, and contacted at least one supposedly haunted school. My editor was insisting I insert some Canadian content in the book, and was very excited by a story he had found in a large collection of supposedly supernatural spots written by a guy named Hans Hobler, who is considered one of the great experts in the field. This small blurb described an incident that supposedly occurred in a small Albertan town involving the ghost of a student killed in a car crash on prom night. When I called the school, I found myself talking to a woman who had not only worked there her entire professional life, but had actually been a student there when the incident was supposed to have taken place. She had never heard of it. When I emailed her a photocopy of the page in Hobler's book where the incident is described, she pointed out to me that the car named in the blurb wasn't actually manufactured until the 1990s, 20 years after the story was supposed to have taken place. I told this to my editor, and he tried to convince me to write the story anyway. I told him I talked about it with a woman who had both worked and went to the school, and had never heard of the story, and who pointed out this hilarious anachronism. Yeah, but there are kids who went to high school in St. Albert who don't know they went to the same school as Marc Messier, he pointed out to me. Yeah, I told him, but I guarantee you that every kid who went to that school that same year he did can tell you every detail of that year. Even he couldn't argue with this, and he let it go. That experience made a definite impression on me. Hobler's books were considered to be among the best and truest in the ghost field. Yet here, I essentially debunked one of his stories without even trying. How else would it be, how hard or easy would it be to do the same to any of the hundreds of other stories found inside that one book? If you couldn't trust the best, who could you trust? For the next couple of years, I was spared from the ghostwriter's paradox when my next assignment saw me working on collections of short fiction, a book on urban legends, and another that featured essays on my favorite horror movies. I wrote these books to suit my own taste, which meant some people loved them, other people hated them, and many more were indifferent. Thanks to Google, I found a MySpace page dedicated to a 15-year-old girl who declared my gothic ghost stories her favorite book of all time. Thanks to Amazon, I found a review for that same book by someone who found it really boring and was under the impression it was written by a narcissistic goth lesbian. Who's to know which one is right? But this blissful period was short-lived. The Canadian dollar had risen, which meant importing books to the US was no longer as profitable as it once was. Shane decided to listen to his salespeople, who always preferred the non-fiction books because they were easier to sell to small mom-and-pop stores. And from that point on, I was only assigned regional titles like Ghost Stories in Missouri, Ghost Stories in New Jersey. By this time, my work on the fictional books spoiled me for any attempts at realism. I dealt with the paradox by ignoring it. I decided my only goal was to tell entertaining stories, even if doing so meant disappointing folks who wanted me to confirm their beliefs in the supernatural. My process was to scour websites and find short descriptions of supposedly haunted locations and turn them into whatever kind of story I wanted to tell at that moment. I paid little attention to such petty details as location and history, to the point that I couldn't tell you a single thing about the state of Missouri after I spent 3.5 months writing Ghost Stories of Missouri. The result was no different than when I wrote my fiction. Some people loved them, some people hated them, many more were indifferent. I learned it was impossible to please everybody, so there was no point in trying. I told the stories the way I wanted to, because that was the easiest way to get them written. And even then, it was a struggle, considering how many times I was forced to go back to the same well. Between 2002 and 2006, I wrote an average of a ghost story a week. But when you factor in such details as my non-ghost books and combinations of deadlines, epic bouts of procrastination, the reality is that there were weeks when I wrote 10 ghost stories. Once I wrote 4 in one very long day. You would think that I would have some insight into what makes a good one. But ultimately, all I know is that like any story, it comes down to creating compelling characters and placing them in interesting situations. Often true ghost stories provide you with neither. So if your first goal is to tell a great story, you're going to have to nudge the facts. something tells me I'm not the first person who's written these books to come to this conclusion. And since so many of us depend on the work other people have produced for our research, we are in essence telling stories, based on stories, only loosely based on the truth. And if that's true for ghost stories, it's probably true for most other kinds, which should make me cynical, but doesn't. We live the truth every day. Do we really need it confirmed to us in everything we read? I don't know. I'm sassy. And that's it. I'm supposed to be a half hour, so if you guys have any questions or if you want to get me out of here, that's fine. Yeah.
Actually, if you went to the school Mark Messier did, they don't let you forget it.
They don't let you forget it? Yeah. I didn't think I thought it was a pretty bad example.
I went to the same elementary school. There's no escape.
My high school had ghosts.
They all do. And so does every hotel. You know, that's one interesting sort of like, oh, there's this great hotel. Like, you guys do realize that people love to stay at hotels that have ghosts in them. So it's just a coincidence that it happens to be haunted and not a tourist trap. No. Okay. So, yeah. No question? Okay. I get it. You don't want to hear any more from me. I'll get out of here. Get out of here. Thanks. It was a great talk.